want to start a 4-part series on the book of Ruth. And you might think, well, we're kind of hoping for a Christmas series. This is a Christmas series. The book of Ruth is a very important book of the Old Testament. In the Old Testament law, there is a law that the Jewish people understood very well that we, in a modern democratic society, don't. In the Old Testament, a person who borrowed money, borrowed property, and could not pay back the debt lost their freedom and became what we would call slaves. They became what legally is called an indentured servant. There was a time limit on how long they could be a slave. But God didn't want a culture of slavery among the Jews. He didn't want a person to be sold as property. And so, if you saw a slave doing a good job, you could not go to the owner and say, I want to buy that slave from you. And the owner could not take money and then transfer ownership to you. The slave, the indentured servant, was only the indentured servant to the person he owed the money to. Makes some sense. There ought to be consequences for not paying back your debts. But then there was the law of the kinsman redeemer. And that law said that you are not without hope in your servanthood, in your slavery. You could have someone else pay your debt. And you would get out of jail. You would get out of debt. You would get out of slavery, and you would be free. But there's a catch. It has to be a kinsman, a family member. That way, slaves were not just being traded like commodities among people and creating a slave culture. No, the family could set you free. Had to be a kinsman. Ruth is the only book of the Bible that explains this law with a story and how it works. And it's going to be vitally important for us to understand the rule, the law of the kinsman redeemer, because you are all victims of debt. In our sin, we have created a debt. That's why we pray in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Some translations will say, our trespass. The meaning is that which we cannot pay back. And so Ruth is that story. It is the Christmas story of the Old Testament. It's 4 characters and 4 acts. 4 people that we want to focus on and 4 chapters of the Bible. In the days when the judges ruled, before the law had allowed for kings like David and Solomon, in the days between that Old Testament overtaking of the Promised Land and Moses and Joshua until the kings, there was this period of time we call the judges, and the judges ruled only when called upon. They didn't rule every day. It was only when Israel was in trouble. And during this time, there was a famine. All of Israel was suffering under this famine, and a man from Bethlehem, from Judah, went to Moab to find work and find food, and he took his wife and his sons with him. This is not a new story, is it? We live in a world where people face poverty and loss of jobs, and so they pick up their family and they go somewhere. They might go to Parsons, Chanute, Wichita, Kansas City. Oh my goodness, Missouri even. Far away lands, far away places, California, Taiwan. Take up the kids, you go. And when you get there, is it going to be easy? Yes, there's going to be jobs available, but it's not going to be easy because now you're the foreigner in a foreign land. There's going to be hardships. And so here is this family, an Israelite family, a family of the promise of God, who are not allowed under the rules of the law to do certain things like eat pork. Those poor people. Bacon. Oh. They're not allowed to enter in the house of Gentiles. And they're going to live in a foreign land where pork is on the menu. And your coworkers might invite you over to the house. And you can't go. And so life is going to be difficult. And like anybody that's lived overseas knows, it happens. The longer you're overseas, the two boys, they fall in love with foreign girls. Oh boy. Now, once the father picks up the family, moves them to another country, he has the rudeness, the audacity to get sick and die. Can you believe it? That's what husbands do, isn't it? They get you in trouble and then they just leave. Sandy prayed every day when we were in Taiwan. Just keep him alive till we get back. So, Naomi, she's in trouble. She can't get a job. So she's now depending on her sons to work and take care of her. And what do? Well, Dad thought it was a good idea. And they get sick and die, leaving Naomi with two daughters-in-law who also cannot work because in those days women just didn't work. And you know, they don't speak Hebrew all that well. It's hard for her to talk to them. But she loves them. They stick together because they're family. Even people that marry into family, they're family. They stick together, and then she hears Israel is out of famine. Israel is prospering again. We don't really know what kind of time frame we're talking here. We're guessing it's about 4 to 5 years that she's been away. Maybe longer. We're not sure. My guess from reading it so many times, I'm thinking it's almost a decade that she's been gone. And so she says she's moving back home. Moving back home. Sandy, is that a good feeling to move back home? Yeah, especially when it's Thanksgiving and Christmas time. She got to have Thanksgiving with her family at their table for the first time in 22 years. She had a smile that went past her ears. It was great. I'm going home. And, well, the two daughters-in-law, they're home. But Mama is leaving. So they start packing up to go with her. What are they going to do? They've got no man to take care of them. Mother-in-law seems to be pretty smart. Let's follow her. And she says to them, daughters, I love you dearly, but go back home. Let your families take care of you. You'll be moving to a foreign land where the rules are different. We don't have bacon. You'll hate that. They cry. They say, no, we're going with you. And she pleads with them again. And finally, the one daughter, she has a TV show now, Oprah. She says, no, I'll go back home. It is kind of scary. But Ruth is different. And as we just heard from the reading, where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay, and your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. We read that a lot, and we don't really put the flesh and blood on it to understand what's going on here. In ancient times, and even now in the world for some people, gods are locational. There are many people in Taiwan that believe that the God we worship, Jesus and the Father and the Holy Spirit, is a locational God. He's only effective in the United States and Canada. And in Taiwan, they think, well, we have to worship these gods. And many of them, when they come to America for a job or something, they'll start going to a church. And then they move back to Taiwan and they go back to the Buddhist temples. And this is really what Ruth is saying at this point. She may not be fully understanding of this God that she's coming to know. Well, I'll move to this place and your God will be my God. The key here, I love you. You are family to me. I will go where you go. We're both widows. We've got no future, but at least I've got you. I'll go back to your country and be a foreigner. I'll go back with you because I've got nothing else but you. And so they cry again because, it's a chick flick. There's always crying. Sorry. And they go. Naomi hadn't been home in a long time. And the friends gather around her and say, Naomi, it's good to see you again. Where have you been? What's going on? How are you? They see this foreign girl tagging along with her. The Israelites were not always very kind to foreigners. The law told them to be kind to foreigners. Their own law of God told them to treat foreigners as honored guests. But they always kind of looked at foreigners oddly as people who ate pork and said bad words and didn't honor the one true God. And even though she had proclaimed to Naomi, I will be with you, your God will be my God, these people never always trusted that. How long do you have to live in Erie before you're from here? I met a guy who said, I've been here 22 years, so I'm still a newcomer. Ruth's going to always be that newcomer. She's always going to have that Moabite accent. She's always going to have the weird smells in her kitchen. She's always going to have a different way of doing things. But they say to Naomi, how are you? And she says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. That word, Mara, is the Hebrew pronunciation of a word that you know, Mary. This is a new Mary from Bethlehem. She's changed her name to Mary. Did you know that Mary is the number one name for women in the whole world? If you take the names of people for the whole world, the name Mary is the most popular by percentage. Or variations of it. Mara, Mary, Marilyn. Do you know what it means in Hebrew? It means bitter. It's symbolic of the fact that women, because of the curse of Eve, I don't know, they have the most love and the most joy, and it's through the most bitter of situations, the most difficult. They bear a burden that men just go, who cares about it? We're a bit broody and unsensitive sometimes, but not women. And here comes Naomi saying to her friends and family, for the first time they've seen her in a decade, I am bitter. We just celebrated Thanksgiving. I want to tell you that there are times to recognize your bitterness. To say up to God, I'm hurt and I'm bitter and I don't know why you've dealt so harshly with me. God's going to honor that as we see. There's 4 characters in our story that we need to look closely at as we read all 4 chapters of Ruth. First of all, we have an old, sad widow of Israel. She's bitter. She doesn't understand why her life has been so hard. She doesn't understand why her husbands and sons have been taken from her. She doesn't know her future. She doesn't know how she's going to survive. But there's that glimmer, that small spark of hope still within her because she is a widow of Israel. And she knows that her God has brought people out of worse conditions than what she's in. And we have a young foreigner widow, her daughter-in-law Ruth. who is now in a country that she does not understand. She's in a place where she's not entirely welcome. People are going to look at her as a widow foreigner, and they're going to say to her, well, there's only one job she's good for, and they're not going to say that word out loud, because that's what a lot of foreign widows end up doing. But there's a young man of Israel, strong, bold, heroic. People look up to him. They consider him to be an upstanding star of the city, which is very unusual because as we learn about him, we also find out that he has a mother who is a prostitute. These are our four characters in our story, and it all takes place in the city of Bethlehem and starts with a woman named Mary, who is angry and lost and alone and says, why would God put me through this? Why would God allow me to be in this situation? A young woman who's also in Bethlehem thinking, why am I in this situation? Why am I so destitute? Who is this God that would do these things? But there's a young man who says, I've seen God do great things. And his mother, the prostitute, who says, I have seen God deliver me from death. There's four people. Each one of them is rejected in one way or another. Each one of them is uniquely alone in their city. This is the story that we're going to be looking at in preparation for Christmas. You see, the book of Judges was all about failure. It was all about people failing in their sin and ending up in terrible situations, but God delivers. And Ruth is right between that and the book of 1 Samuel, where God gives them a king and Israel enters into its most glorious period of history. Between Judges and the kingdom, there's Ruth, the Gentile bride. Between the law and the kingdom of Christ, there is another bride, made up of Gentiles, the church. Between judgment and harshness and law and forgiveness and grace, there's a woman, hopeful about the future. Every single time, God uses this image to illustrate this hope. Among the Jews from ancient time until today, the book of Ruth is always read at Pentecost. And the celebration of Pentecost in English is the first fruit. It's celebrated in the springtime when the farmer gets the first fruit off the trees, out of the field. The first harvest is Pentecost. And every Pentecost, to this day, the Jews publicly read Ruth. Because there's hope. We've survived the winter. We've gotten through the worst of days. And now there's fruit. Between the law and grace, there's a woman full of hope. In the darkest days of your life, God is using his power and his purposes to bring an explosive change into your life. And here's Bethlehem. Bethlehem is a very small city. Why would Bethlehem be chosen as the birthplace of Jesus? The book of Ruth answers that question as we read through it. In giving birth to Benjamin, in the book of Genesis, Rachel sacrificed her life and died so that Benjamin would be born in the city of Bethlehem. She thought that her son's life was more important than her own. Well, her husband Jacob remembered Bethlehem because of a death. And all throughout the Old Testament, we see memorials to Bethlehem and Rachel's tears. But now the world is going to remember Bethlehem because of a birth that brings new life. Bethlehem is the city of David. And where there was once death, there is going to be life because of a faithful woman. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep, the silent stars go by. Yet in the dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. Go ahead and read through the book of Ruth this week. It's only 4 chapters. And what you will see in this story is the foreshadowing, the promise of Christmas. Next Sunday, we're going to have a concert by the Missourians. So you get a week extra to do your homework. But I wanted to get this introduction to have you thinking about Ruth as we go into our story next time I speak. If you have a decision to make, if you have a prayer that needs to be prayed, if you have something to share with the church, now's the time to come forward